How does the human body moves? Let's find out. Movements in different directions take place via the axis and the planes, but not the flying ones. An axis is a line about which movement takes place, and a plane is the surface in which the movement takes place. Movements takes place in planes at right angles to their axis during any part of their movement. Classification of axes and planes. These could be classified as number 1, vertical axis and horizontal plane; number 2, sagittal axis and frontal plane; number 3, frontal axis and the sagittal plane. Now let's discuss them. Vertical axis and horizontal plane. A vertical axis lies parallel to the line of gravity and movement about it is in a horizontal plane. Number 2, sagittal axis and frontal plane. A sagittal axis lies parallel to the sagittal suture of the skull, that is in an anteroposterior direction. Movement about this axis is in a frontal plane. Now, the third one, which is frontal axis and sagittal plane. A frontal axis is also named as cardinal or transverse axis. It lies parallel to the transverse sutures of the skull. It is also horizontal and at right angle to the sagittal axis. Movement about a frontal axis is in a sagittal plane. Mechanics of movement. Movements of the body occur at the joints. Therefore, axes pass through the joints and the part moved is in the plane which lies at right angle to the axis of the movement. Now, the application of axes and planes in human body. Number 1, sagittal axis and the frontal plane. Movement of abduction and adduction and side flexion are said to take place about a sagittal axis and in a frontal plane, with the exception of the thumb that we will discuss in the later section. Number 2, the frontal axis and the sagittal plane. Movement of flexion and extension takes place about in a frontal axis and in a sagittal plane, with the exception of thumb. Now, the third one, vertical axis and horizontal plane. The rotational movements occur at the vertical axis and a horizontal plane. Why does the mechanics of thumb are different? The movements of thumb takes place at different axes and planes as compared to other body part. It is because of its anatomical position. The movement of abduction and adduction of thumb takes place at a frontal axis and a sagittal plane, while for all other joints it doesn't happen like that. On the other hand, the movement of flexion and extension or thumb takes place at a sagittal axis and the frontal plane, which is totally different from the mechanics of the other body parts. Now, we will discuss the plane of movement and the gravity. Number 1, movement in a horizontal plane. Movement in a horizontal plane is not affected by gravity and is therefore stated to be gravity free. Weak muscles, which are unable to produce movement against gravity, can often succeed in doing so when part moved is supported horizontally. When the only external resistance which opposes them is the frictional resistance of the supporting factor. Number 2, movement in the inclined plane. Movement in this case can be up the incline or downwards. The resistance to the muscles is least when the incline is nearly horizontal and increases as it approaches the vertical. Movement downward is produced by the force of gravity. The magnitude of its force is increasing as the inclination approaches the vertical and the reaction of the plane decreases. The third one, movement in the vertical plane. Upward movement is produced by a force such that of muscular contraction which exceeds the force of gravity. Downward movement is produced by force of gravity and occurs at a specific speed which can be modified and controlled by the muscular action.